Communications and Engagement. I'm the Director of Communications and Engagement for Denver's Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. Tonight, you're going to be hearing from Blake Adams, who is the Zero Waste and Circular Economy Manager. Before we talk about the agenda for this evening, I will hand it to my colleague Alejandro Arrieta, who's going to talk about the interpretation services if you need to opt into the interpretation services. Alejandro?
Thank you very much, Emily. I appreciate you all for having me here with you. I am going to go ahead and provide these instructions in Spanish first, although they do apply to everyone, so I'll be hopping back and forth. So thank you for your patience while I do that. Hola a todos, mi nombre es Alejandro Arrieta, seré el intérprete del inglés y el español el día de hoy. Gracias por estar aquí. Ante nada queremos mencionar que en esta reunión queremos practicar la justicia del lenguaje lo más posible. Por lo tanto, van a ver que usaremos varias herramientas, ¿no? Para que cada persona pueda participar en el idioma de su corazón. En estas instrucciones voy a estar repitiendo todo en inglés también, así que gracias por su paciencia en lo que cambió de idioma. Ante nada, usaremos la interpretación como una de las herramientas para establecer la justicia del lenguaje. Si usted prefiere escuchar en español, como pueden ver aquí en el ejemplo en su pantalla, van a poder ver un icono terráqueo que aparecerá después de todas estas instrucciones en la parte inferior a mano derecha en su pantalla. Cuando vean ese terráqueo, van a seleccionarlo y escoger el español, y si es necesario pueden regresar a poner el audio original en silencio. And so again, thank you all for having me. And in this meeting, we do want to practice language justice as much as possible. And we're going to be using a few tools to make that happen. So if you're not fluently bilingual in both English and Spanish, we want to make sure that everybody is ready to participate in the language of their preference. So after all of these instructions, you won't see it quite yet, but afterwards, a globe icon is going to appear on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Once that globe icon appears, as you can see in the example on your screen, you'll go ahead and click on it and select English as your preferred language. If it's necessary during interpretation, you can always go back into that same setting and hit mute original audio. Next slide, please. Próxima diapositiva. Otra herramienta que estaremos usando para que puedan participar en el idioma de su corazón por completo es que estaremos compartiendo la presentación, la diapositiva en inglés y en español. Entonces, en la parte superior de la pantalla verá un menú que dice donde van a poder escoger los dos, pues la opción que ustedes gusten, ¿no? Van a ser dos opciones, en inglés y en español. Si ustedes prefieren ver la versión en español, van a seleccionar el nombre que dice Natalie Lana y español justo después. Y lo voy a repetir en inglés antes de continuar. Another tool that we'll be using to establish language justice in this space is we'll be sharing two screens. So you'll see that we have the English presentation and the Spanish presentation. So on the top part of your screen, you'll go ahead and click on that drop-down menu and select Anna Erickson, which says English at the end. That will be the English presentation if that's how you choose to participate. Next slide, please. Próxima diapositiva. Y también verán que tenemos la configuración de respuestas y preguntas por sus siglas en inglés Q y A. Siéntanse libre de mandar sus preguntas en el idioma de su corazón. And you'll see that we'll also be using the Q&A function here to take questions. So please feel free to send your questions in the language of your preference. So with that, we're going to go ahead and turn on the interpretation in just a moment, and you all will be able to select your Sounds good. Are folks able to hear me on the English channel? This
Yes.
is Alejandro.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you, Alejandro.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
I lost Alejandro's sound and I don't have the globe icon.
It'll be in your options, more interpretation, and you should be able to select.
Let's give everyone a few seconds to just find the right channel. Thank you all for being patient with us. Okay, Alejandro, Natalie, are we ready to proceed?
Okay, I see Natalie nodding.
Okay,
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. And please, any attendees, if you need any assistance with finding the right place, just add anything to the chat. So I will ask Anna if we can go to the agenda page slide. Okay. Hi, everyone. Again, for those who joined us a little bit late, we now have, we are about to begin the presentation in English, but we have Spanish interpretation available if you need that. So please ask any questions. If you need any help, you can put that in the chat. Tonight, the agenda topics are going to include the origin of the Waste No More ordinance, what the Waste No More ordinance requires, a little bit of background on the Waste No More task force that's been meeting since spring of this year, the purpose of the task force and the process. And then Blake is going to walk us through the recommended supports and changes for Waste No More that we are asking members of the public to share feedback on. We've been doing stakeholder meetings across the city. We very much value feedback from the public on this, so we are very much excited to answer questions. We will have about 25 minutes for question and answers. The way to submit a question will be use the Q&A tool. I won't be monitoring the chat function for questions that you have related to the content on this. So please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. I will help to provide those questions to Blake, and we can run through any answers to them and help you walk through a little bit of the background of Waste No More. At the end, we'll talk about how to participate in public comment. The last thing I will note, we have updated denvergov.org/waste-no-more with lots of frequently asked questions, information, all of the meeting summaries and recordings from all of the Waste No More task force meetings. So that is a great repository of information for after this meeting. So I will be sure to share that again at the end of the presentation. And without further ado, I will send this over to Blake Adams, the Zero Waste and Circular Economy Manager with the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency.
thank you so much, Emily. And thank you to everyone in attendance tonight. Again, my name is Blake Adams, and it's an absolute pleasure to have this opportunity to interact with you all. Tonight, we're going to be, as Emily mentioned, we're going to do a presentation for about 25-30 minutes, which should leave plenty of time to go into detail what the Waste No More task force has been working on, what the ordinance will require. And then the real goal of tonight is to provide plenty of time for open Q&A. Lastly, we'll finish talking a little bit about how you can all participate in the public comment process. So without further ado, next slide, please. So for many of you in attendance tonight, you might be familiar with the origin of the Waste No More ordinance. You may have even voted on it last fall. But we're going to kind of assume that you don't have an understanding of it, and we're going to walk through just a brief history. So for years now, the city and county of Denver has had a low rate of diverting waste away from landfill. We've never had, as a community, as a city, citywide requirement for recycling or composting in a commercial or residential setting. The Waste No More Coalition was formed to gather signatures to put this measure forward on the ballot back in 2021. At the time, the measure did not get enough signatures. However, in 2022, it was successful, and it was introduced during the 22 general election, which 70% of voters approved. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about what is the Waste No More ordinance and what does it require. Next slide, thank you. So what is required under the Waste No More ordinance? Well, the ordinance requires residential and non-residential buildings and permitted special events to provide access to on-site recycling and composting in addition to trash. So essentially, 3 waste streams: trash, recycling, and composting. Access to on-site recycling and composting can be defined in basic terms as having convenient and accessible containers with proper signage and labeling and accompanying service. Service here, when we talk about it, is solid waste collection service. Essentially, does the residential or non-residential building or the permanent special event have a hauler to manage that material and to take it where it needs to go? When we talk about recycling, we're talking about paper, plastic bottles, aluminum cans, corrugated cardboard, cartons, glass bottles, and jars, just to name a few. When we talk about compost, we're primarily talking about organic waste, primarily food waste in this setting, but there are other materials such as yard waste that in certain settings would be acceptable. Also required for buildings are to provide education to employees, customers, and their tenants. Covered entities must also submit an annual recycling plan to the city, which will outline the strategies in place for that covered entity to comply with the ordinance. And lastly, buildings are required to include recycling and composting within the janitorial contracts that service that property. Next slide, please. So we talked about what is required, but now let's talk about where it is required. I mentioned residential and non-residential buildings, so let's be a little bit more specific. When we talk about residential buildings, we're talking about multifamily residential buildings with 8 or more dwelling or housing units. And I'll just take a moment to clarify the reason that this cutoff is established is because the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, DOTI, provides solid waste collection services, which include recycling and composting, to single-family households with 7 units or fewer. So by requiring the multifamily residential sector to provide this provides every resident in the city and county of Denver with direct access to recycling and composting. So quite a beautiful thing. On the non-residential side, this one's a little bit simpler. It covers all non-residential buildings. The ordinance also applies to permitted special events. So any event that is occurring in the city that requires a permit will have to provide both recycling and composting alongside trash. This ordinance also covers construction and demolition projects over 500 square feet. And the ordinance also requires food waste producers, those listed there on the right, included but not limited to the typical food waste businesses that are operating in the city, to provide composting. Next slide, please. So we talked about the what and the where. Let's talk about the when. I want to point out that this is the current established compliance timeline in the ordinance as it was introduced last fall. And you'll notice that some of these dates are already have come and passed. I'll cover them in a second. So primarily by June 1st, 2022, multifamily residential buildings with 75 or greater units must comply alongside food trucks and permitted special events. It's important to note that this date has come and passed. And so in technicality, these requirements are currently in place. However, for very obvious reasons, we are not currently enforcing on these requirements, and the task force is working to update these. I'll speak more about this in a moment. In addition, you have on January 1st, 2023, also another date that has come and gone, multifamily units between 25 and 75 units, commercial buildings with 25,000 square feet or above, and food waste producers of 15,000 square feet or above, and all construction and demolition projects. Further down the timeline, we have June 1st, 2024. Multifamily buildings, 8 to 24. So now all multifamily would need to comply, alongside non-residential or commercial buildings, 5,000 to 25,000 square feet, and food waste producers, 5,000 to 15,000 square feet. And then lastly, the final implementation deadline in the ordinance as is June 1st, 2025, requiring all other commercial and all other food waste producers to comply. Next slide, please. Now we're going to have a brief discussion about the task force, the Waste No More task force that was formed and has been meeting since March for the last 5 or 6 months now, and the outreach that we're doing now. Next slide, please. So the Waste No More task force was formed to ensure that the language that was put forward in the ballot could be enforceable. As we mentioned just a few minutes ago, the compliant dates in that ballot language are now out of date and need to be updated to reflect our current moment in time. The task force is essentially discussing recommendations to update the ballot language. And it's important to note any changes to the ballot, or to the ordinance, will need to be approved by a supermajority of city council, that is 9 of 13 members. And task force collaborations are viewed as highly crucial and have been successful in terms of, I think, the work that we're doing to clarify the rules and requirements. Next slide, please. So the task force is comprised of 26 members, including a wide range of voices and stakeholder groups and community members, including city council members. The full list there on the right. And as I mentioned, the monthly meetings have been occurring since March, and they've been meeting monthly from March to July to discuss different recommendations to ensure that the ordinance is enforceable. There have been working groups that have been meeting in between these meetings on topics of equity, construction and demolition, organics recycling, licensees and licensure processes, and education and outreach. We find ourselves in the month of August, and that is the month of our public engagement process, where we are hosting these sessions for the public, the broader public, to voice their concerns, to submit their comments in response to recommendations that are put forward. In September, the Waste No More Task Force will meet one more time to revise and finalize their report that will go in front of City Council later this fall. Next slide, please. The purpose of this outreach is quite important. It's really to explain the requirements to the broader public, to review the proposed changes, but most importantly, provide you all, members of the community, an equitable and accessible chance to voice your concerns, suggestions, and comments. Primarily, we are interested in talking about what are the perceived barriers to success for the rollout of universal recycling and composting, and what additional supports are needed. It's important to note that this discussion tonight we are not debating for or against whether this ordinance should be put forward. That decision was made last fall when 70% of voters approved of the measure. What we are doing tonight is simply discussing the recommendations that the task force has put forward, as well as giving you all an opportunity to voice your concerns, broadly speaking, on the topic of waste, recycling, and composting. Next slide, please. All right, so this next segment, we are going to be talking about the recommendations that have been put forward by the Waste No More Task Force. And we're going to start with the recommended supports. Next slide, please. The Waste No More Task Force has identified 2 primary ways to support the community in their attempts to comply with the rollout of universal recycling and composting. And those are education and financial support programs. I'll speak briefly on education first. Under the topic of education, there is a recommendation to develop a compliance guidebook or an online resource hub. You can think of this as sort of an online library of materials, best practices, technical support, workshops, trainings, all of the above, with the intent of providing one-stop shop accessible to all to learn more about how to become compliant and also how to learn how to be good stewards of our environment and divert materials away from landfill. The task force has also recommended education campaigns that emphasize the why. Why is this important? Why are we as a city and county moving in this direction? Also recommended on the education is creating consistency among language. That includes language access, pictures, signage, and symbols. So standardized symbols for recycling, organics recycling, reframing compost collection as organics collection, color coding, containers, labels, signage, and creating consistency among other city operations. And last but certainly not least, ensuring that education that's put forward is provided in a culturally specific and competent way. Under the topic of financial support programs, the task force has identified grants and incentive programs to offset some of the service costs that will incur, businesses and properties will incur from needing to add additional services like recycling and composting. Also, the offset hiring of new staff that might be needed, employee training, or other things occurring on site. It could also support the production of educational materials, which include signage and flyers and trainings and purchasing of actual equipment and containers. There's also a strong emphasis on household affordability, ensuring that there's a reimbursement fund for under-resourced households that pay for waste directly. And again, last but certainly not least, programs should prioritize under-resourced people within our community and small businesses. Next slide, please. The first two supportive recommendations are really about empowering the community for a just and equitable transition. These next two are all about supporting the marketplace. I'll speak to that now. So the first is on city purchasing requirements. These requirements would require the city and county of Denver and the agencies and offices to procure or purchase and use finished end products that result from waste diversion activities. These are typically referred to, as compost, digestate, other blended soil amendments, and then other recycled materials like concrete, paper, the types of things that the city and county of Denver will procure in a typical annual budget cycle. And this is to incentivize the marketplace, to create the end market for use of these materials so that when waste is diverted to a recycling facility or to a composting facility, it is returned back to the city and county of Denver. And we are taking that leadership role to ensure that it stays locally and that we can close the loop. In addition to city purchasing requirements, we have city zoning and permit policies. Essentially, these would allow an easy, streamlined, and accessible pathway for businesses, big and small, that operate in our region and within our city and county to cite their operations, their businesses, to cite recycling and composting businesses, again, big and small within the city and county of Denver. And this will really help to create more processing capacity And I will note that both recommendations are designed to reduce costs over time for implementation. Next slide, please. So we talked about supportive recommendations, and now we're going to talk about the recommended changes to the actual ordinance. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned previously, the compliance timelines in the ballot language that was put forward last fall are now out of date, and we've been working tediously as a task force to update them to reflect our current moment in time. And so now the recommendation that's put forward by the task force is for large buildings, for residential, this being 75 units or above, and non-residential buildings of 25,000 square feet or above, to be required to come into compliance 12 months from the adoption of rules, but no later than January 1, 2025. For medium buildings, which is defined as 25 on residential buildings, 25 to 74 units, and non-residential buildings between 5,000 and 24,999 square feet, to be required to comply 18 months from the adoption of rules, but no later than June 1 of 2025. And lastly, on the small building side, for residential buildings with 8 to 24 units and all other non-residential buildings must comply by 24 months from the adoption of rules, but no later than January 1, 2026. I will pause for a second just to restate that under this recommendation, all covered entities would need to become compliant by January 1, 2026. Next slide, please. On the side of construction and demolition, which is what C and D stand for, so any construction project occurring in the city, it might be new construction, it might be a retrofit, a remodel, or a full demolition and new construction. The updated recommendations for the timelines are by January 1, 2025, all construction projects over 500 square feet must achieve a 50% solid waste diversion goal. That means that the percent of material under their project that's either being produced or removed under that activity must go to recycling, reuse, or other pathways. It must not be sent to landfill. By January 1, 2028, 65% of those materials must be diverted. And by January 1, 2030, 80% of those materials must be diverted. And I'll point out that there will be exemptions for buildings deemed a safety hazard. These performance metrics are not covering all materials that would come out from a building project or a construction project. There would be a list of recyclable materials, recoverable materials that those project managers would need to divert. Next slide, please. To incentivize the construction and demolition sector to divert their material, the task force has put forward a recommendation to charge a deposit at the time of the permit issuance, and that deposit size to be based on the size of the project, in this case, square feet. The deposit would be fully refundable when the contractor would confirm to the city and county of Denver that the required diversion rate was achieved at the end of their project. Partial refunds would be issued for meeting some but not all of the requirement. And again, the objective is to incentivize a high compliance rate without resorting to fees for non-compliance. I want to just mention that the amount of the deposit has not been identified and shall be determined through a study or further study on the city and county of Denver's part. Next slide, please. Lastly, we're going to talk about compliance timelines for permitted special events. And this is where it gets a little, where there are some options available. So I'd like to start at the bottom, because the current ballot language currently has option number 4. So in place currently, all permitted special events, regardless of size, must comply with these requirements. In this case, though, they must comply within 24 months from the adoption of rules, but no later than January 1, 2026. So option 4 would cover all events with no phasing and by January 1, 2026. Okay, so now I'm going to go back up to the top. Option 1 being presented is for large permitted special events to go first, but in 3 phases, starting with 10 events that have 10,000 attendees or more within 12 months from the adoption of rules, but no later than January 1, 2025, followed by events with 3,000 attendees or more a year later. And then lastly, events with 350 attendees or more 2 years later, or 3 years from the adoption of rules. Option 2 places large events first, but in less than 3 phases, in 2 phases, with events over 3,000 attendees complying within 12 months from the adoption of rules, but no later than January 1, 2025, and events over 350 needing to comply a year later. Lastly, option 3 has small events having to come into compliance first, starting with events that have 350 to 3,000 attendees, followed by events over 3,000 attendees. It's important to note that events with less than 300 permitted special events, I should say, with less than 350 attendees are assumed to fall into the de minimis exemption category. Block parties are also exempt because their permit does not require a waste hauling plan or service. And events permitted by the Department of Parks and Recreation may or may not require a waste hauling plan and service, separate from the waste receptacles already in the parks, depending on the size of the event and type of permitted issue. So this is an example of where there are options available for you, members of the public, to weigh in on. The recommendation is not for one at this current time, but there are 4 options available. Next slide, please. Thank you for listening to me. We are now going to move into the segment of tonight's event, where we provide you, members of the public, to submit questions for which we will try our best to respond to. As a reminder, we'll be fielding questions using the Q&A function. And I might ask Emily Gideon to moderate this. But again, please submit questions using the Q&A function. You may find that on the bottom left of your screen on the bar.
All right, we already have about 5 questions in the queue. So we'll go ahead and get started on some of these questions. I will read them out to Blake and he can provide some answers. We do have some of our colleagues from within the city of Denver who are from other agencies outside of the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. So some of the requirements, well, basically we're taking a whole of government approach to all of this. So we work closely with our partners within other city agencies. So if there are some questions that are more relevant to other city agencies, we will either have our colleagues on to talk about them, or we will follow up with you if we don't have the right person to answer it. But many of these should be within the wheelhouse of what we can answer. So I will start. The first question we got was from a bit earlier in the presentation. Blake, can you clarify what, if any, parts of the ballot language are not fully enforceable?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Emily, for supporting. There are, I would say there are specific words, terms, different processes, different agencies that are identified that need to be updated based on to reflect and to be more compatible with the way that Denver will typically implement policy like this. And so really the devil's in the details. I also mentioned those compliance timelines, some of which have come and passed. So those kind of collectively would represent those areas that are not, they're not in a language that we can enforce. It's not that the requirements are not enforceable. It's really sort of a language and a syntax thing with different and how it relates to existing code, rules and regs, and so forth.
Okay, and I think Pat asked that question. So if you have any follow-ups on that, just include in the Q&A. But we'll move on to another question. How does this affect cannabis cultivation?
I might pass this question off to Erica Rogers with the Office of Excess and Licenses to answer that. I think she might be more familiar with this space.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Blake. This is Erica Rogers. I'm the policy director over in Excise and Licenses. So I know we might have some marijuana licensees on the call. I don't know that it will impact cultivation in a specific way, aside from the fact that the ordinance does apply to all non-residential buildings. And so that would include any type of marijuana business would have to comply with the requirements to provide that 3-stream recycling and composting, obviously by the deadlines that apply to the non-residential buildings. So if you've got a business, whether it's a liquor licensed business or a marijuana licensed business, if you're not producing food waste or compostable waste, you would at least have to comply with the recycling requirement. So that would probably be the main way that as a cannabis business, you would interact with the ordinance.
Thank you so much, Erica, for that. And Beverly, please put forward any follow-up questions that you might have in the Q&A chat.
All right, I'll move us on to the next question, which includes, I think, some helpful feedback as part of what we're collecting for recommendations. But the question is, will the list of entities that get subsidies for service costs be made public? This person has shared, I have no doubt that my rent will go up. I live in a large downtown apartment building, and it's possible that they would apply for a subsidy too. They mentioned it needs to be transparent and fair and monitored, and suggested that we could make a condition of subsidies for the housing sector be that they do not pass the cost on to renters. So Blake, do you have, has this been discussed at the task force about whether entities that get subsidies for service costs will be made public?
So this particular recommendation, I don't believe has been discussed, but I fully understand and appreciate the comment. I think it's something that we will pass along to the task force. I think, again, the goal is to make sure that any subsidies that are provided to entities that apply are using that to offset costs that would impact individual residents and homeowners, or depending on if it was a small business, their patrons, so they would need to increase costs. So I think this is a fantastic point and a recommendation we will follow up on.
All right, moving on to the next question on the list. I'm actually going to go to Julia's question, and I'll circle back on a few of Pat's, just because we've answered a few of Pat's so far. So we will circle back on those. Julia asked a question, why are the construction and demolition dates so far out? For example, 2030, why would they need that much time to comply?
Yes, so I think the specific timeline that you're pointing to is the 80% waste diversion target for construction demolition projects. And so the requirement is for construction and demolition projects that are occurring now or 12 months after rules and regs the 2030 date is when projects would need to reach an 80% waste diversion rate. And the reason that that date is so far out in time is because the task force has identified the need for the marketplace for construction and demolition waste recycling and reuse to come online. And so currently the capacity is not there. And so in order to achieve an 80% waste diversion rate for their projects, I think the task force just simply feels that we need, as a region, more time to make that transition. But again, just to clarify, all construction and demolition projects would need to achieve a 50% target much sooner than that. It's not pushing it out all that far. It's more about the threshold at which they would need to comply.
Okay, another timeline question. What is the rationale for different timelines for various sizes of residential or commercial premises?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, the Waste No More ordinance can be sort of referred to or thought of as a universal recycling and composting ordinance. Now, the city and county of Denver is not the first locality to introduce such a policy or set of requirements. And it is a best practice to start with the largest buildings, both residential and non-residential, because typically larger properties, the larger the building space, the more residents or households are producing more waste. So they're sort of identified as large generators of waste. And so it is a best practice to start with the largest generators and slowly phase in medium to small. For example, the city of Austin, Texas, one of the best case studies on this had followed the same route. And I believe that was the rationale that the original ballot sponsors wanted to follow.
Another question here, how will the city monitor and enforce compliance?
Another really great question, and I think something that we will be determining in time. When the task force is really solely focused on making sure that the requirements of the ordinance are enforceable, they're clear, and that they are equitable and provide for a smooth transition. It will be the job of both city council and the executive, as well as different agencies, to determine the exact strategy that the city will put forward. However, I will say one thing, that the task force has really emphasized an education first approach to enforcement. So what that would mean would be, in, let's say, a restaurant downtown was struggling, or they identified that they were not in compliance, the city would go out and provide education first, warnings second, and only fines as a last resort. And so I think that just demonstrates that the task force understands that the challenge is in place for particularly small businesses and smaller multifamily residential properties to comply. And because of that, there's an emphasis on education first as an enforcement strategy.
Great. Moving on to another question, sort of starts with a comment, but the attendee mentioned that Chipotle used to have much more recycling, which has mostly disappeared. Composting was mixed with food. What accommodations can be made to avoid this? I guess maybe the implication is like backsliding on, or confusion with how people dispose of waste. And they ask, is it the best model to implement mixed stream where items are commingled?
The Waste No More ordinance specifically requires 3 streams. Those being trash, organics, and recycling. There may be some examples in certain settings where a multi-stream or multiple recycling stream, multiple containers for different recyclable materials, say paper, glass, plastic, would be present, and those businesses would be in compliance. Mixed streams would exist, but specifically for those 3 streams. So you would have trash commingled with trash, organics commingled with organics or compost, and recycling with the approved recyclable materials commingled in that single stream.
Okay, next question is about how would compost work with plant waste like stems and soil? This is a type of product that requires locked containers. Also, who would we need to contact for the compost recycling of the waste?
Okay, so I'll take a couple questions in there. So
It might be just first about
yeah.
organic waste and maybe haulers who haul compost recycling.
The ordinance is currently scoped to cover food waste producers. However, it would be up to each covered entity to determine whether they would want to include other organic materials, such as yard waste. You mentioned plant waste like stems or other soil or mulch products. But that would be a determination by each covered entity. Really, the organic stream is meant to cover food waste producers, so food waste. And to the question of who would we need to contact for the compost recycling of the waste? Well, if you were a resident or a tenant, I should say, of a multifamily residential building, you would contact your property owner or your landlord. If you were the property owner or the landlord, you would contact a organics hauler, a compost hauler, to ensure that your tenants had that service in place. And so depending on who is asking the question, it would differ. But it is the responsibility, I should say, for the responsible party is on the building side. So typically in this case, the property owner, the property manager, or the landlord to provide all 3 streams to employees of that space, tenants, and residents, as well as the janitorial staff that service those.
All right, so there's a question around waste haulers. I'll kind of combine 2 questions that came in. How are waste haulers being accounted for in the compliance? This person gives an example that their small multifamily building of about 24 units has recycling with a waste hauler. So they would be in compliance, but the hauler often fails to pick up the recycling. So that negatively impacts their building's waste diversion. And they have been told that the waste hauler does not pick up recycling when they should, because they don't have staff capacity. So that's certainly something on the comment side that we should consider and bring back to the task force. But Blake, do you want to share how haulers are being engaged or accounted for in the compliance scheme?
Yes. In brief, the solid waste hauling community is not specifically covered under this ordinance. This ordinance covers buildings in the sense that they must hire a hauler to perform those services. A best practice in the case where a hauler is not living up to their agreement or collecting the material that they've agreed to, it would be up to that property to make the determination whether to terminate their agreement and to find a hauler, an alternative hauler, that would perform those services. So this is, so again, haulers are not covered under the ordinance. Properties are, but it is certainly something of note and something we will bring back to the task force.
Okay, I'm going to go back. There was a follow-up question for Erica after the cannabis dispensary question. The attendee asked, does this mean that dispensaries may not have to provide composting, only recycling, since they do not produce waste?
Yeah, that's a great question. So under the current language, marijuana, cannabis businesses will have to comply with the recycling requirements in a phased nature based on the size of that non-residential building they're in. And there may be, specific language that you'll want to dig into regarding, right, if you're renting a space from a property owner. We know individual situations are going to vary on that. But currently, marijuana businesses aren't included as food waste producers or compostable waste producers that have to comply with those composting requirements. I know that the marijuana industry has state mandated specific requirements for how that cannabis plant waste is disposed of. So as Blake mentioned, if that's something you choose, you want to choose to offer, you can, but it's not required under this ordinance. That said, if anyone has a recommendation regarding entities that are required to compost non-food organic material and you want to weigh in on that, whether it's marijuana or another industry, please feel free to let us know your thoughts through this survey, and we'll take all of that into consideration.
Thank you so much, Erica.
All right, moving on to another question. This kind of harks back to a couple of questions ago as we were talking about waste streams or commingling, but we got a question about how will the approved materials be decided in each stream for recycling?
So following the process that's ahead of us, which is the task force will meet in September to finalize recommendations and submit a report to City Council. That legislative process begins. We expect it to begin in the fall. And once that legislation is approved and voted on, the rules and regs process, the rules and regulations process will follow, and there will be discussions about what are those approved materials. It will largely be, I think, a consensus-based discussion, one that likely involves the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure to ensure that there's consistency citywide on what are accepted or approved based on the stream. So the set of recyclables, for organics, what food items are acceptable. It might not be all food waste. It will be sort of a decision there from a technical standpoint. And then on the construction and demolition side, there's also discussions about, from a technical standpoint, what are recoverable or readily recyclable. I think us city officials, we have some work to do to determine that, but I think it will be largely reflective of the reality on the ground, what the current marketplace can provide, and what is in place already across our city.
Great. I'm going to go back. I skipped ahead on a couple of questions because we'd had a few from the same submitter. So I'll go back on a few of these questions. First, will the list of entities, I actually think that we have answered this one already. So this is the question. If you are giving the entities an out by showing that they've made a good faith effort, does a new deadline go into effect, or are they completely off the hook forever? Does the city have the capacity to process more than the current amount of compost or recycling? If so, could there be a change to the state law so the city could be a provider? So asking a little bit about some of the good faith effort language, and then questions about compost and recycling capacity for some private haulers, and then questioning if the city would be the hauler if there was a change to the state law.
I think the last question is a little bit of a hypothetical, for which I won't respond to today. There's state legislation, state law in place that would, I think, prevent that. So hard to respond there. But in terms of the former too, if a business, put forth a good faith effort to find a hauler and could demonstrate that they could not either there's not enough drivers, there's not enough trucks, the haulers are fully at capacity, there's some sort of force majeure issue with supply chain, something like that. It's important to remember that covered entities have to submit an annual recycling plan. So every year the city would be monitoring whether that business put forth that good faith effort. So let's say, for example, in 2025, a business owner could not find a compost hauler. Well, they could certainly submit their annual recycling plan and demonstrate that. However, they would need to resubmit that proof or that burden of proof in 2026, the following year. And so I believe that this would not allow covered entities to simply try once and stop there. It would be a constant monitoring of each covered entity's compliance.
Okay, I will encourage folks, we are at 7 o'clock, so please, if you have any more questions, I would ask you in the next 5 minutes to insert them. We have about 2 more remaining questions, and then we'll get to any others. And after that, we will close out and we can follow up with folks afterwards with more information. But I'll move us on to the next question and comment. So one attendee noted, the city has a poor track record on providing permits for construction. The lack of trust between the city inspectors and residents is palpable. How do you plan to build trust when there is a deposit involved? When I read the information today in the questionnaire, it is unclear.
I might ask our colleague Erica Rogers to respond to the specific question of the permits for construction and that process.
So that's going to be, that's actually not in excise and licenses, that's in CPD. So I don't know if we have a CPD colleague on the call. I'm really sorry, I can't answer that.
Apologies, Erica, for.
No worries, that's a common mistake.
We'll make sure to follow up on that question from a representative of CPD following tonight's presentation.
Yes, and I've been making note of all of the questions for any follow-up, and we of course have a city email address that is open with any follow-up questions around Waste No More, and we've gotten great engagement and people from the community asking us questions, and we've been following up very soon with good answers. So this conversation is not the end of the conversation, and I'm glad we've sparked some good questions and thoughts here. The last question that I see right now is, how will it be ensured that the streams are not mingled? For example, tenants not separating correctly. Is that the landlord's responsibility?
So it's actually a very important question. Thank you, Denise, for posing that. The Waste No More ordinance is really all about access. It's requiring property owners and buildings and business owners to provide access to recycling and composting. Performance, in this case, are things being commingled? Is there contamination? Is not covered under the ordinance. So there are no performance requirements under this ordinance for businesses. However, as we mentioned, there is responsibility of the responsible party in a residential setting. That would be a landlord In a non-residential or commercial setting, that would be a property owner, manager, or the tenant within that building, the small business or the business within that building, to provide education to their employees, to their tenants, to their patrons. And so along with standardized messaging for labels and signage and colors for containers, in addition to all of the work that the city will be doing in terms of educating the public on how to recycle and compost correctly, this should take care of that issue in time. So that is a built-in requirement for education to be provided. And the city will be hard at work in terms of designing this system so that is standardized and universally understood wherever you go.
Okay, I see a good follow-up from Pat, and thank you, Pat, for helping to include a couple follow-up questions that I might have missed in the past. Pat's question is, will the deposits / fees be robust enough to motivate enough entities to comply? They shared that too many of the developers pay the fee instead of building required inclusionary zoning under that ordinance. They asked, will the fees for non-compliance also be included in the recommendations? And Pat shared the suggestion, and don't return the deposit if not in complete compliance. So question is, has the task force explored whether deposits or fees will be robust enough to ensure compliance?
That is the goal. The goal is to set those fees based on the size of the project so that they are enough to motivate those entities to comply. The task force is not deliberating or discussing the exact dollar value of those the refundable deposits for construction and demolition projects. However, there is some discussion about the relative size and best practices in that. So the goal is to design those to be sufficient to motivate, but not too much to disincentivize the project altogether or to make the economics not worthwhile for that developer. So the specific fees will be outlined in the rules and regs that accompany the legislation. They're not going to be specifically carved out in the recommendations. And lastly, your point about the idea put forward of not returning the deposit unless if they are 100% compliant is something that we will bring forward to the task force as a public comment, as a recommendation. So thanks, Pat.
All right. This will be the last question I'll take from the chat, and then we will close out for the evening. This last question, does providing access mean a condo, for example, needs to provide organics recycling, composting as an amenity? Or management would need to only provide space for the collection bins and residents pay the compost hauler individually? Right now, individual residents through a condo composting program pay the management as the single entity player, but the residents are responsible for dealing with the hauler as well as the participating residents. I might need.
Yeah, so I think this is might be one of those unique cases where there's a certain type of relationship between the landlord and the resident or the community. And we would provide that, some outreach and some technical assistance to ensure that access was being provided. If the arrangement is such that, in this case, space and containers might only be what is required. But in this particular case, we would need to actually come out and speak with you all, with the landlord, with the tenants, and that will be part of the technical outreach that we do when this gets rolled out citywide. So I think that more than anything, I think this question, which is a great one, points that there are a diverse set of arrangements and settings and infrastructure, space, depending on the size and location of your business in our city. And so the charge of us as officials are to make sure that we can implement these requirements universally, regardless of what the specific limitations or constraints are in place. And so I think this is just a little great example of how we will need to provide education specific to different residential, established relationships or settings.
Thanks, Blake. All right, I have seen a few inquiries in the chat or in the question and answer section about providing these slides for folks. So what we will do is we will post these on the Waste No More website, and that's denvergov.org/waste-no-more. We can also, I believe, since folks registered for Zoom, we can follow up with an email as well, since I know a lot of folks might be interested in this. So in the next few days, we will be posting the slides, and we will also be posting the recording of this town hall online. So we will have that available in English and in Spanish. So the last few things, Blake, that I will ask you to go over is just to reiterate the timeline and next steps for providing feedback on the task force recommendations, and then maybe what comes next. Could you share that with everyone and share a reminder about taking the survey online?
Yes, please. And thank you, Emily. Next slide, please. All right. So again, thank you all for joining us tonight. I hope you found this insightful. I think we've certainly learned quite a bit from you all, from your comments and questions. So thank you so much. So we just want to end again during the month of August. So today being August 17th until August 31st, we're under a public comment period. And so the best way to participate is to visit us online at denvergov.org/waste-no-more. Not only can you learn more about the Waste No More and its requirements, there's also a nifty FAQ, or frequently asked questions function on the site, which will answer the typical questions that folks might have. But we really want to encourage you to access the Waste No More Task Force Recommendation Feedback Survey. This is the platform for which we are gleaning input from the community. It's designed to be as user-friendly, it's accessible in all languages, and it will be up online until August 31st for members of the community to provide their comments. We also ask you all to help us spread the word. So between the next 2 weeks, please share this opportunity with your friends, your family, your colleagues, and throughout your community. The more voices and the more comments that we receive, the better the task force will be informed and be able to make stronger recommendations for the ordinance. And lastly, you can submit at any time now until in perpetuity questions, comments, and concerns to us and our team via email at wastenomore@denvergov.org. And now I will, last slide, please, Anna, and I will turn it over to Emily just to close this out.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We've made note of all of the questions and all of the follow-up. So again, we will be posting a recording of this town hall online, and we will also include the slides for easy reference. I'll do one last plug for denvergov.org/waste-no-more. That's where you'll find frequently asked questions. It's where you'll find the survey, and it's a great source of information for any questions you may have. So please stay engaged on this issue. Reach out to us, reach out to waste-no-more@denvergov.org with any specific email questions if you have questions for our policy experts or our staff. But thank you so much for being engaged and being curious, and sharing your feedback. This is incredibly valuable, and our team has learned a lot on this call, and we're looking forward to continued education and conversation with the community. And with that, we will conclude this evening. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.